press record now because I'll forget. And just while people are joining, I will introduce our speaker today. I'm very happy to have Ginger Shultz giving this month's Circunar on writing and chemistry. And Ginger, as I was just discussing with her earlier, she has a PhD in polymer chemistry, which I found out just today, and use this PhD learning in a recent publication on writing in polymer chemistry. So she's used her prior knowledge very effectively. But after a PhD, she moved into education research to a teaching-focused postdoc at the University of Michigan, and very quickly joined the staff there, faculty in 2016. And looking across her interests, for somebody relatively new on the scene, she's already got more than 10 publications by my count. Really amazing output on things like PBL and labs, things like pedagogic content knowledge and graduate and teaching assistants. There was a recent CNEN article that talked about musical performance and organic chemistry, so I thought maybe we might hear a little sing-song later or something. But in general, I think her work is characterized by a real sense of clarity around thinking about theoretical frameworks and thinking about a real clear sense of method, and really, really impressive to read. And it's nice that you'll be talking about this idea of writing today, because I think obviously comes true in your own practice as well. So that's enough for me talking. I'll just say to the audience that there's a chat area accessible via a purple button in the bottom right-hand corner. And the way the Circunars work is we tend to have discussion points about halfway through and at the end. So as you are thinking of questions or comments you'd like to make, if you type them into that chat area, I'll fish them out and pass them on to Ginger. And I think especially for this month, we have some activity at the start, so you can get your typing muscles ready to type in some responses to a question that will be prompted. But I'll shut up now and pass over to Ginger, and we look forward very much to hearing her talk.
Thank you, Michael. I'm so excited. Thank you for including me in the Circunar. I didn't realize that's what it was called. I like that. I've been following these. I had been teaching around lunchtime, so I missed a number of them, but I'm so glad they're posted on YouTube, because there are a number that I wanted to see, and I was glad to be able to see them that way. I think that this is a fantastic thing for the community in general, to be able to share more broadly. And so again, I'm happy to be included in this. So as Michael said, I'll be talking about our Writing to Learn in Science project here at the University of Michigan. And the talk today will include two components, practice and research, both of which are informed by social cultural theory. And I'm going to start with practice. So I want to tell you how we've been able to, disseminate Writing to Learn curriculum at Michigan, and how we've been working with faculty in different disciplines to develop and implement writing assignments. And then we'll have a break, and then at the end, I'll talk about two different studies that we did to try to understand the role of writing in promoting learning. Oh, I tried to advance differently. Okay, here we go. So I kind of want to prime you a little bit and get you thinking about this question. What was the last thing that you wrote, and why did you write it? And so this is what Michael was referring to. If you will go to the chat box and respond to this question, we'll just take a minute or so for everyone to respond to this and see what comes up.
So I'll just come back in here and read out things. Internal grant proposal about funding undergrad research, notes for a conference, invitation to a workshop, proposals, summary of student work as part of a manuscript. So quite a broad range of topics there.
Yeah, so I do this once in a while when I'll talk about this project, because one of the things that it kind of raises and surfaces for the audience is to begin to think about how widely we use writing, and then also how kind of broadly defined writing can be. We use it every day, all the time, in a variety of different ways, and it's incredibly important for our scholarship and our own work. see, changing slides. Okay, so that said, I want you to now think about writing in terms of the classroom. So we use it in our own work quite a bit. So let's begin to think about how we might use it in the classroom. So in science, there's two ways that we can think about how writing is used. The first is most prevalent, I would say, and that is using writing to communicate understanding of concepts in science. And that might be anything from a short answer essay question on an exam or a lab report or something like that. Well, writing to learn, as we'll be talking about it today, is a bit different. The idea with writing to learn is that it will transform understanding, and that it has the capacity, a unique capacity, to do that. And some of you may have been familiar with writing to learn, and some of you may not, but that's the essence of it. So this is another way to think about it, and to more think about how is it that knowledge can be transformed through writing. And really, it's an interplay between thinking about what is it that I need to write about and how to best write it to convey it. And that interplay between thinking about the content and writing about the content is really the mechanism, I would say, in how writing transforms learning and the way that we think about it. So writing to learn has been around for a long time. We didn't invent it. I wish I had. And I think even before this first reference here in 1994, writing to learn had even been around quite a bit before that. These are two seminal works and one that's on its way out by one of our collaborators. So if you're interested in writing to learn and want some key reviews, these are ones that you can look at. So this first one by Rivard, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, this is one of the first reviews that I found, and this was in 1994, reviewing what had been done in writing to learn. And the major call from that study was that there was a need for a stronger research base to support the notion that writing can promote learning. And then later on, there was this review by Bangor-Jones, and in this review, we saw that there was quite a bit more research that had been done, but the bulk of that were in dissertations, and there were actually surprisingly few peer-reviewed articles that investigated the role of writing to learn. And then in this more recent study that is under review right now by our collaborator here at the Writing Center, Ann Gear, they looked more particularly at writing to learn in science, at publications on writing to learn since 1990, and of the 1,700 that they found, only 46 of those met their criteria as having either an experimental or a quasi-experimental design with a control and an experiment groups, and meeting 4 criteria that defined writing to learn. That is, that there was a meaning-making task, clear expectations, that they were interactive, and then also involved some metacognitive aspects. And these were all in peer-reviewed journals. So there is now, I think this shows that there's a good body of work that's being built in this area, but there's more that can be done. But that's a nice marker of what's happened. And again, these are some good references, I think, if you're interested in this. So after that, just brief introduction to thinking about writing to learn more broadly in science, I want to focus now on writing to learn at the University of Michigan and the way that we think about it. So our interest in writing to learn is really thinking about these large introductory classes that we have. So this is the one of the largest lecture halls on campus, and I show this picture a lot in talks because I think it's one of the things that many of us are dealing with when we think about the dissemination of evidence-based practices in education. And that is that in these sorts of classes, this is the perspective that faculty are thinking about when they decide whether or not they're going to adopt a practice. And that is scale. How do I scale this practice for this many students? And the other thing to think about when looking at this picture is thinking about the student's perspective as well. I sort of think about this as being alone in a crowd, right? Because there often isn't a lot of interaction between students in these classes, And, even though there's lots of students around, they may not be talking to each other about the learning and the things that are being talked about in class. So this is the perspective that we're thinking about when we wanted to disseminate writing at the University of Michigan. So with that in mind, we conducted a couple of studies to try to understand faculty conceptions of writing and its relation to the acquisition of disciplinary knowledge. So one study focused on interviews with faculty, and there were 30 faculty from across the sciences in different academic ranks and types of positions. And one of the things that we found was it was almost without exception, faculty regarded writing as not only being important, but actually essential for the scholarly work in their discipline. They ranked it very, very highly and regarded this as being quite important. But for some faculty, and a good number of faculty, there's a real disconnect between how they think about writing in their scholarly work and the role that they see it playing in their classroom. So there are faculty who do use writing and see it as valuable in different classes, but there are also faculty who think that it's not their place to use writing, that belongs somewhere else than in a classroom. And so those are some of the beliefs that we've thought about when trying to work with faculty and how we would help them. The second study that helped inform how we were working with faculty was a large survey. I think probably some of you in the audience may have been participants in this survey. It was sent out a few years ago, asking faculty about their use of writing in the classroom. And this is one of the findings when we compared those faculty who said they did and didn't use writing in the classroom and the sort of barriers to their use. At the top, you'll see that these are all sort of beliefs about writing, whether or not they regarded writing as being important for the classroom and a few other things. And at the bottom that I've shown in a box is more having to do with the practical barriers to writing, that I don't know how I could fit it in to the course. I don't have TAs that can assess writing. It's a large course. There's limited class time and insufficient resources. And these were the things that, as you can see, they agreed most strongly with as being barriers. And these were things that we thought that we could address for faculty in order to help them. So that's what we focused on. So we had 3 different strategies that we've started to employ a few years ago to help our faculty who wanted to use writing to learn in their classrooms. And these are really around this sort of idea, thinking back to that image of the large stadium seating classroom, that they couldn't possibly read and give feedback to 400 students. So I think that number could even be changed to 40 students, and the barriers would kind of be the same, is that takes a lot of time and effort to sit and read writing and give feedback on it. But feedback is a really important part of the process and a part of doing writing, and so it's something that needed to be addressed. So we're helping faculty in 3 different ways to be able to ensure that students get feedback on their writing. And so these are sort of using people and technology resources. So for each of the classes, we have what we're calling peer writing fellows that work with the faculty to give students feedback. And then we also use an automated peer review system and a personalized messaging system to help students. So the peer writing fellows you can think about as being similar in a lot of ways to peer-led team leaders or peer tutors and things like that. They're there to help their peers. They're nominated by faculty because they were someone who really did well in the course and perhaps was a good leader or communicator, but not necessarily because they had done any writing or anything like that in particular, because what we care about is the learning of content, not in developing students as writers. They do take a 1-credit course that's managed by our Center for Writing, our Campus Center for Writing, to help them think about how to help students learn through writing. And they support the courses in a variety of ways. So they will hold office hours with students so students can meet with someone in person and talk about the writing that they're doing. They monitor to make sure the students are submitting their writing and participating in peer review. And that may mean something very different in each class. So faculty have defined that in different ways. And then they also communicate directly with faculty. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And some faculty meet with them weekly, some faculty less often. But they are really a conduit for faculty into thinking about what students are learning from the courses. So this is a quote from one of the writing fellows. One of the things that we've started to look at is how the writing fellows benefit and from participating as fellows in the project. And this was a student who was a fellow for our introductory biology course. And essentially, the way that I think about this is that, we all know that you learn more by teaching. So there is a component of the value for them in that they're learning by teaching. But the other value is that they're reading a lot of papers on a particular topic that are all different, writing about things in different ways and having to evaluate those critically. And they're learning quite a bit from the process of doing that. And one of the unanticipated benefits of working with these writing fellows that has been talked about by our faculty is how much what the fellows have been sort of a lifeline to them, to the courses. And this faculty member in particular is our instructor that we're working with in Economics 101. And, he teaches a very large class. And you can imagine that when he talks to students, it's often more about the negative things, like why didn't I get points and why, I'm not understanding this, can you help me? And he wasn't getting a lot of the positive back. And so what he found was that meeting with fellows and working with them, that he started to have a much more positive experience in his course again. And so this is something that we're seeing as a real benefit of having the fellows. So now we'll talk about some of the technology resources that we provide for faculty. So we do use an automated peer review system. We're not the first people to use this. There are a number of peer review systems that are out there. Essentially, in our case, the students go on to their learning management system. We use Canvas, and we have a tool that we built for the project, an automated peer review tool. And we have an entity on campus called the Digital Innovation Greenhouse that helped us to develop this. And really, we just wanted something that would be very easy for faculty and students to use. We didn't want to create any technological barriers for them. And so what we learned is that the number one requirement for any such tool for us was that it had a single sign-on with our learning management system, that students weren't having to go onto a separate tool in order to participate in peer review. And that for some faculty, even that barrier, if you want to call it that, was insurmountable for them. And so that was really important for us. But if you're thinking about using writing, I would say there are a number of peer review tools that you could use. If you have something on your learning management system, it doesn't have to be really sophisticated or have all the bells and whistles that some of these tools have. It's just the basic idea of organizing students together in a way to provide feedback. So I wanted to talk about why we rely on peer review so much. Some people have the idea that students aren't capable of giving quality feedback to each other and so forth. And there's actually been a number of studies that show that is actually not the case, that students are capable of giving useful feedback. And one of those studies was by Christian Schoen, and I've just shown one plot from a paper that he put out on this. I know some of you have met Christian. He's come to a couple of chemistry education research conferences. But this is his study where he compared the kind of feedback that content instructors, writing instructors, and peers were giving. And what you see is that students were giving identifying as many explicit problems in writing that they read and as many explicit solutions that was comparable to both content and writing instructors. So that just is to say that that you don't have to be an authority on a subject in order to give useful feedback to students. And an additional study, and this one is maybe even more valuable in my mind, or is more informative to us in my mind, was the comparison of, or basically this idea that is there value in the act of giving the feedback, that is, in reading someone else's writing and thinking about how to give them feedback. So in this study, I would focus just on this left-hand side. I just remembered that I can turn my cursor on. So I would focus on this left-hand side where you see those who only received feedback versus those who gave feedback. Those who gave feedback benefited much more from the process of giving feedback. And so not only are students capable of giving good feedback, as I said on the previous slide, they actually benefit. And so when we engage them in peer review, we're doing something good for them. So the last piece of technology or technology resource, the second technology resource that we've begun to use, is really centered around this idea that, if I have 400 students or 40 students or whatever, it's hard for me to sit down and give them individual time. But if I could, imagine the scenario that I had the student sitting down in front of me. What would I say to that student, and how would I say it, right? So this tool is really about enabling faculty to be able to do that. And the tool is called Ecoach. It was built by a physics education researcher here at the University of Michigan and developed by him. Is being used in a number of our courses. And fortunately, it's being used in a number of the courses that are doing the writing to learn with us. And so we're able to leverage this. And the idea behind the tool is that we take information about the students. This may be some information from the registrar in terms of their grades and their major and things that they care about, but also information that the students provide about themselves, what their goals are, what their motivations are for taking the course, and that kind of thing. And then it takes the advice and the expertise of instructors who are involved, as well as students who've been successful or maybe less successful in the course. And behavioral specialists take all of this information and create tailored messages that are sent, individual personalized messages that are sent to the students that help to sort of coach them and advise them through the course. And so imagine that a piece of that information could be something that we take from the writing about what students are understanding or maybe not understanding. If you have some subset of students who didn't understand a concept, if we see that through the writing, then perhaps we could send those students a message that helps them to overcome that or address it in their revised draft. And so that's the idea, and that's where we're headed. Right now, we've started with messages that sort of coach them in a different way. So this is an example of the screen that a student would see in this system. This is for a statistics class where we're helping students and coaching them through the peer review process. And one of the things that we want to do is to change their beliefs about the value of peer review and whether or not they can actually get good reviews back from other students. And notice, so there's some of the things that I talked about in the studies that I showed you that there's a benefit of doing peer review, but we underscore that with a comment from a student who previously participated who said that peer review was surprisingly helpful. And they even say, I realized that reading other people's writing, I can see the mistakes they've made, and I can make sure that I personally don't make those mistakes. So they're seeing the value of not just getting the feedback, but also the giving the feedback. And what they've learned in the system is that it's important not just to throw these authoritative ideas towards students, but that students may actually resonate more and get more and respond better to advice from their peers and coaching from their peers who have experienced the course previously. So the next slide is just an additional example of a message that we've sent out on helping students to understand how to revise. Often students see a first draft and it's sort of cemented in their mind that they think that they don't have to do anything to improve that draft, that it's gold. But we're trying to help them to not only use the feedback that they got, but also to think about it from the perspective of when you read, what did you think about? And really getting to make the revisions because that's where a lot of the learning occurs. So that's the last kind of resource that we provided for faculty. And these are, again, showing the 3 resources. And what we're working on next is this sort of dashed arrow here, which will be how do we take information from the writing and use that directly in tailoring and providing these individualized messages for students. And that's something that's going to be a long time working, because it's quite time intensive to first analyze large sets of writing and then to train a computer on what we care about. But that's what we're working on next. So the last thing in terms of thinking about working with faculty at Michigan that I want to talk about is how we've worked with faculty. So this kind of goes back to the beginning of this project happened when I was a postdoc, and I started working with the woman that you see on the left. That's Ann Gear, and she's the director of our Writing Center. She's also the president of the Modern Languages Association, so kind of a powerhouse person in her field. And she and I started thinking about how do we use writing to learn in our general chemistry class here, and then we later worked in physics. And what was important about this early relationship was the kind of interplay between what she cared about in terms of the writing and what I cared about in terms of the content, and how do we help the students learn the content and what constitutes learning in terms of general chemistry. And those were some pretty important early conversations, and that sort of taught us that really what's important is a partnership, because you can't go in with a prescription that says this is exactly the kind of writing that you need to do, and we're going to tell you how to do it, even though we're not experts in terms of how to teach that content. And so that was a kind of early important lesson that we learned. And I should also mention that this is a picture of Anne and I at an ACS conference. So she was very bravely went and presented with me at an ACS conference a few years ago. So these are the courses that we're in that we're working with faculty to go into. Notice that the numbers under each of the titles are the number of students that annually take these courses, so they're very large. Statistics and economics in particular are quite large. And so this faculty partnership has been very important in terms of thinking about that. And these are also places where you wouldn't normally see this kind of writing. And so we're pretty proud of the fact that in only 2 years in, we have thousands of students writing about content that they normally never would have written about in all of these courses. These are some of the faculty that we've worked with. Mitchell Dudley, I talked about earlier. He was the one who talked about his experience with the Writing Fellows. We have someone from engineering, someone from statistics, and someone from biology. There are a number of others that we've worked with. But in each of these cases, what I want to say is that these were faculty that believed in the value of writing and wanted to use it, but saw these practical barriers as being an issue. So we didn't have to convince them that it was worth doing. We just had to give them some tools to make it a more tangible thing for them. And we worked with each of them very closely in the last few years to develop writing assignments and to think about that. And we learned a lot through that process of working with them and partnering with them. We're now expanding, so we have a seminar because we're not going to be able to work with faculty as closely as we add more and more into the project. So we have this seminar that faculty can sign up for, and the participants are not only faculty, but they're also postdocs and graduate students that may come with the faculty as a part of the team, because we recognize that that's one of the things that may help faculty is if they have someone else to kind of carry the burden with them. But they're all interested in using writing to support learning in large courses. During the seminar, they meet weekly for 1 term. They discuss writing to learn with their colleagues from all of these different disciplines. And then they develop writing assignments, and in writing they like to call these prompts for a specific course that they have in mind. So that by the end of the seminar, they have a set of assignments that have been vetted by their colleagues and an idea about how to do this in their own class. Okay, so that's kind of the picture of faculty. Now I want to talk about assignment design. So now we're finally getting to some of our theoretical framework. So we think about this in terms of sociocultural theory, and just a quick way to think about that is the idea that we learn through the interactions of others. So as we interact with others, we take in ideas and information and we incorporate that into our mental structures as individuals. So that may seem a little strange for writing, because I think a lot of us think about writing as being a solitary activity. But what I'm going to show you is, in fact, that this is actually very appropriate, particularly for how we've thought about writing to learn. So if you think about the process of writing, there's a process of writing, and one of the very first things that you may do before you even get your keyboard out and start typing is to think about what you're going to write about and to gather additional information about that. And some of the things that you're thinking about are the audience that you're going to write to and things like that. So in some respects, this is sort of an anticipatory socialization that is happening, where you're anticipating who's going to be reading or who's going to be thinking about your ideas as you put them into a written form. I heard someone describe this one time, and it's one of the favorite ways that I've heard this described is thinking about if you're at a party and you want to join into a conversation, the first thing that you're going to do is listen to hear what other people are saying. So you're listening in so that you can think about, when you begin talking, what is your contribution to the conversation. So that's really what this initial part is. It's thinking about what your contribution is and how you're going to make that in writing. The next step is in actually sitting down and writing it. And then the peer review step after that, that's the part that's most obviously social in nature, in that students are asynchronously basically having a dialogue about the writing that's put out there and learning from each other in that fashion. And then the final part is the revision. There has to be a revision because there has to be something to motivate them to take the feedback that they've received and really thought about how to incorporate that. So that's how we're thinking about writing to learn from a theoretical perspective. So with that in mind, we have a number of best practices, because again, we don't want to go in and throw a prescription on faculty about how to use this in their courses, but there are things that we know that work well. And some of I've listed here, so using accessible sources, models, and examples. Some of these are rhetorical in nature, so thinking about the particular genre that you want students to write in. Of course, very important is thinking about an audience and a purpose for the writing. That really plays into the social cultural framework that we just talked about. It is writing to learn, and so we want to have also clearly delineated learning objectives. So those come out in terms of a criteria and a rubric. There has to be some meaning making that happens in the writing and something to motivate that meaning making. And then the last two pieces that we talked about, that there should be peer review and revision. And those are the things that we try to impart on faculty as we're working with them. If you're interested in seeing some examples of writing assignments, there is a link here. This is just on the Sweetland, this is our Writing Center website. From all of the different disciplines that we've worked in so far, we have a sample writing assignment that you can look at. I wanted to look specifically at a writing assignment, and this is the one that Michael was referring to earlier that revealed my origin in polymer chemistry. So we were working with a faculty member in material science engineering to implement and design and implement writing assignments across her course. And this is just an introductory material science engineering course. And these are kind of the key pieces. These are the sort of rhetorical pieces of the writing assignment, that one writing assignment that we came up with. So in this, we've given the student a role. So they volunteer for, they're a volunteer for a social service organization. We have a lot of, as part of the culture here at Michigan, students do a lot of service, partly because so many of them are pre-health and pre-med, and those are ways into their future career goals, I should say. So we're selecting roles that I would say are aspirational for them, things that they see themselves doing or are even already doing in the writing, and we see that as being important for part of the motivation, I suppose. They have a clear objective, so they have a supervisor in this social service organization, and they're meant to help them to convince potential donors that recycled milk bottles are good materials for using in creating school bags. And the context here is that in some remote community that students don't have good school bags, and so this is serves a service purpose. They have a specific audience, so it's an activist with minimal scientific backgrounds, and one of the things that we've seen and that we've come up to is that that the audience is actually, who you specify as the audience is quite important, that you want it also to be somewhat aspirational, and that while you don't necessarily want it to be an authority on what you're writing about, you want it to be someone who has other credentials and that they would see as being important. And then specifying a genre, I don't know why I call this persuasive summary, it's really more of an argument. And then a problem. So these are engineers, and engineers like to solve problems. So we had a problem to solve. And then we had a source that they looked at, and this was a paper in the Journal of Applied Polymer Chemistry, which I enjoyed looking at as the source of this. By the way, this is published in JChemEd last year, if you want to look at this in detail. And then, of course, this is writing to learn. So as I said, that we always have specified learning objectives. We present these very clearly to students so that they know what they're meant to be writing about, and so that we can make sure that they're actually writing about the things that we want them to learn about. So here, for this assignment, we wanted them to analyze data that was presented in that paper that I showed that's specific to the physical properties of the polymer. We wanted them to make some estimates and connect that to their everyday thinking about the application. We wanted them to actually produce something called a stress-strain curve that depicts the polymer before and after it's recycled to help them to evaluate the question. And then finally, we wanted them to make some connections between the macroscopic and microscopic effects of an external force that might be applied on the material if it's used in the application. So this is just, I might actually skip over this part because I think I'm going a bit long. But that's just to give you a sense of how a writing assignment might look. So we're coming to the end of the first part of the talk, and here are the key takeaways that I would hope that you take with you. The first thing is that the goal of writing to learn is not learning to write. And I didn't say this explicitly, but I think one of the things that faculty get hung up on is this idea that somehow they have to be helping students with their grammar. And that's not the point of this. The point of this is helping students to learn content. And that means that takes away a lot of these unnecessary requirements that in our mind, as long as the writing is readable and that it conveys an understanding of content, that's what we care about. And I think that's an important point for these kinds of assignments. And then the other important thing here is that the feedback that students have doesn't necessarily have to come from an authority. They can get valuable feedback from each other, and that even more than that they benefit themselves from participating in peer review. And then finally, that you can also involve more experienced students in helping students in this process and meeting with them and helping you to meet the demands of incorporating writing. And then finally, in thinking about writing assignments, not all writing assignments are created equal. We hope you'll see that the kinds of writing assignments that we're talking about in the assignment that I just showed you is quite different from a short answer essay, direct short answer essay that might come in the back of your textbook or something like that. That there's a lot more rich layers that we're thinking about here. So with that, I think this is a time for a discussion break.
All right, great. So there's lots of questions coming in thick and fast. I'll be selfish and start with one of my own, which is, in your assignment is very clear about the genre and that kind of thing. And I think Jeffrey Kovac's work has really made that clear in terms of writing to learn, that you need to be very specific. And one thing Christian Schoen mentioned in some of his talks was the value of peer review is the fact that it makes clear to the student as a writer who they're writing for, which is very often missing from our assignments. We tend to just say to students, write about something, and they tend to write for the expert. So do you get any sense from students or any kind of insight into how students write because they're writing for somebody at their own level of chemistry rather than writing for somebody who's an expert?
Yeah, so we have looked at this. We do we interview students about most all of these writing assignments, and so we've learned quite a bit about that. We've also, and this actually, my collaborator, Ann Gear, who I mentioned, they did a study of comparing two writing assignments where one was a letter to their grandmother about content, and then the other one was maybe to a doctor or somebody like that. And students make very different decisions when they're writing a letter to their grandmother. And so what they saw was there was a lot lower order kind of writing, and that they really didn't write in the same way. And I know that, I guess that doesn't directly answer the question of, what the difference between when you're writing for us, when we don't specify an audience, they're really just writing to the instructor, what they think the instructor wants to hear. And so we really think that the kind of meaning making that is happening and that they're doing is very different in that case. And certainly some of the things that we've done and then others have done have shown that that's important. And so audience is important. And it's not just the audience, consideration of the audience in the initial prompt, but often when we develop a peer review rubric, at the start of the rubric, we say, you are the activist that is reading this. So respond as if you were the activist. And that also has been very productive as well.
In that sense of giving a purpose. So yeah, really interesting. Okay, I will try my best to get through these questions, so hopefully I reflect them well. Jill asks that this idea, instead of giving individual feedback to students, what about giving kind of different standards as whole class feedback? So using examples of low, medium, or high level student work to give kind of, I suppose, overarching what could be improved at each level. Jill, I hope I'm reflecting your question correctly.
Yeah, so we do that already, and different faculty members have done this in different ways. One of the things that they do give examples, for example, of here's a useful kind of peer review comment, and here's a less useful peer review comment, but also giving summaries of here are some things that we saw a lot of students struggling with, and here's how to address it. Or here's an example of writing that didn't quite meet this learning objective, and here's one that did. And so there are certainly kinds of feedback that faculty have done, and I think very effectively in their class session. And that's one of the things that's great about this, is that the writing enables them to do that. It enables them to understand more particularly what the issues that students are having when they're trying to write about a particular topic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Jenny's point kind of follows on from that. Do you give students training in this idea of doing peer review? Or I know you had the peer review fellows, but in general, do they get training?
Yeah, and again, that's different from course to course, depending on how much faculty are willing to devote, how much time faculty are willing to devote to that in their class session. That varies quite a bit. We have guides that all faculty will put up on their learning management system, but as we probably all know, that having a guide there doesn't mean that students are going to look at it. Some faculty do use class time, and as I mentioned, they'll show, here's a peer review comment, that isn't, or even having the students talk about, would you find this peer review comment useful? Which of these comments would you find most useful? To help them think about it in that way, and then also in terms of revision. So we've done a bit of that. And we certainly try to give faculty resources for different ways that they can make that work in their class and help to support students. There are peer review systems that have that built in. So Calibrated peer review is a peer review system that trains students in doing peer review. We don't have that as part of our system. Our system is pretty simple, but we do try to help faculty to do that, because not all peer review comments are equal. There are a lot of really fluffy, not useful peer review comments, but there are also a lot that are very, very good. And so we're trying to get those students who aren't giving useful feedback to really engage with it and do it differently.
Yeah. Well, that leads on to Renee's question. Do you give students, do they have to reflect on the peer review process?
Yeah, so we're just now, so one of the features that we're now being able to add to our peer review system a back evaluation. So there are some peer review systems who do that. And part of that is reflecting not only on was this comment useful, but also how will you incorporate in your writing that feedback. So hopefully that'll be part of not hopefully it will. Eventually that's going to be a permanent part of the system that we're using here. But there's also ways, I know some of the different instructors have done this as an extension of the assignment, that one more step in the assignment is that you have to reflect on the peer review comments that you had and write something about how you used that particularly. And I think that's a step towards more metacognitive things happening in the writing and supporting that.
Yeah. We're tight for time, but these are just two final questions. Aisling asked an important point. Obviously, it's interesting, such vast class sizes, but how well did the peers know each other? Did the peers choose each other? Or, because obviously there's previous sort of friendships, or not friendships, that might affect the peer review process.
So there's the peers, and the automated peer review system is double blind. So they don't know who they're reviewing and they don't know who reviewed them. So there's probably no connection there. The writing fellows themselves, it's possible that they might know some of them, but I don't think that comes up that often just because of the sheer numbers of students in the courses. Of course, that varies from course to course. But we have learned that there's some things that we need to do to help them kind of be a peer and help, and support with at the same time maintaining some authority.
Yeah. And then the last question, are there graduate students involved in this process? And if so, how did they take on the task how did they feel about this, having to work on this task?
Yeah, so far we haven't really involved graduate students in this at all. Part of that, some of the courses that we're working in don't have graduate students involved in the instruction. And then in other ones, it really actually would be harder for us to, at least in this context, to train graduate students in how to respond in the way that we can with the undergraduates who are willing to take this one credit course and do something a bit extra. The fellows are actually getting paid a small stipend to do this, and they're motivated differently. There is a complication, though. I know in my own course, that we have these writing assignments that are happening. We don't ask the graduate students to grade them, but they do need to be ready to answer questions for students, because students are going to go to whoever will help them. And so we've had to spend some time in staff meeting and helping bring them up to speed, and also help them to understand that they, that it isn't their job to correct grammar, that it's about something else.
Yeah. Okay, I've allowed a little bit more time than I planned for questions there, but they're coming through thick and fast. But I will now pass back over to you for the second part.
Okay, great. So thank you for all those questions. When I'm going to come back to this idea about peer review. So the studies that I mentioned earlier, these were all focused on whether or not peer review can help students to learn to write better. And what we wanted to answer was whether or not peer review actually helps as part of the learning of the content. So the first study I'm going to talk about, this was for introductory biology. We did a number of writing assignments in there, and what we wanted to understand was what role the peer review played in helping students to learn content. So I wanted to show really quickly an example of one of those writing assignments. And so in this case, this was aimed at helping students to, essentially they read an article from the Scientific American here, and they were meant to describe enzymes and their importance, and then answer a few other things about them from a particular perspective. So this is just one of the writing assignments, and I think this might be up on the Sweetland website if you wanted to see more. This is also, the study is going to come out very soon in the CBE Life Sciences. And so you can, if you're interested in biology or coming from a biochemistry perspective, that might be useful to you. So essentially our question, the guiding research question that we had for the study was to ask, how does participation in peer review and revision influence students' conceptions? So I want to be really careful about what we mean here, because I know there's a lot of different ways of thinking about misconceptions and ways that this general idea has been applied. we were using this definition from the National Research Council, which calls just misconceptions as understandings or explanations that differ from what is known to be scientifically correct. So we're not trying to project any of those other definitions on here. We're just looking for things in students' writing that differ from what is known to be scientifically correct. So I just want to be precise about that in terms of what we're trying to claim. And what we wanted to do was say, was this useful, or did this serve to identify misconceptions that students had? That is, when they write about their understanding of something, can we elicit the particular misconceptions that they have? And then also, does this process remediate these misconceptions? So, of course, we can't say directly that it remediated their understanding, but certainly we can watch for changes in the way that they write about these concepts, and whether and try to attribute those, see whether or not those are attributable to peer review feedback. So that was sort of the goal of this project. So this is an example of just one writing assignment. And again, this is the one on enzymes that I just showed you. And what we did was we looked at, and we did this for 4 writing assignments, but for each writing assignment, we looked at the first draft and identified all of the what we're calling misconceptions in that draft. We also looked in the peer review comments to see if comments were made directly about that misconception, and then we also looked to see if that misconception appeared or was corrected in the final draft. So here's an example of some of the misconceptions. Some of the misconceptions we identified were already known in the literature, but there were some that hadn't been identified previously in that way. We also saw that we also looked for things like incorrect use of terminology and saw some things that were specific to the prompt. So this is a sociogram that kind of depicts what we were seeing for just a single assignment. I think this was for a photosynthesis assignment. And essentially each of the circles is one student, and all of the connections are connections that either they were getting reviewed by someone or they reviewed someone. So if they were at the base of the arrow, they were the reviewer. If they're at the head of the arrow, they got reviewed. And the colors matter here. So if the circle is black, they had no misconceptions. And then each of these showed the different colors increase in the number of misconceptions. And so then we looked, did they give correct or incorrect feedback? And what you can see is that the green arrows represent correct feedback and the red arrow represents incorrect feedback that they had. And so this was one of the ways that we were visualizing whether or not that there was a particular peer review comment that contributed to a change. And this is sort of a summary of that analysis, or the findings of that analysis. So for each of the 4 writing assignments, we just have a count of the number of misconceptions that appeared, whether or not they were remediated, that is corrected by the second draft. And this was tied directly to a peer review comment. So if there was this student on their first draft got a peer review comment that said this is incorrect and here's how to fix it, and was it later corrected? So that's that count. We also saw that in the peer review comments, that additional misconceptions were elicited. That is, someone said, you need to talk more about this. And when they talked more about that topic, that additional misconceptions came out in the second draft, and that was distinct. And then we also counted how many incorrect, ideas were included in the second draft as a result of incorrect peer review feedback. And from that, we determined sort of a success rate, which we think was pretty good. For each of these, we had a range of success rate, and this is just what percentage of the time from these counts were misconceptions corrected from draft 1 to draft 2. That could be attributed to a peer review comment. And so that's pretty good. One of the things that we are worried about, and this comes back to the discussion, is how do we amplify this? So if we see the success part of the time, I think that we can amplify this by helping the students to do a better job of peer review and be more engaged in the peer review. So just some of the implications of this first study. First of all, that we can use writing assignments effectively to identify misconceptions. And again, this faculty member actually used some of what she learned from these in the class to help students through the writing. And that students are, again, capable of giving substantive feedback to their peers. So this shows this kind of connects back to those earlier studies of peer review, that this is showing that peer review that students actually can give feedback that helps students in terms of how they're talking about content, and that the peer review and revision are important parts of these assignments, and that they provide an opportunity for students to correct these misconceptions in their writing. So the last study that I'm going to talk about, this was something that came in the last thing that I'm going to talk about as well, was an assignment in general chemistry. So this is just a picture of the assignment. So kind of the source or the purpose of the assignment was that the students would imagine they were on Facebook or something, and that they saw this post by someone called Ernie Clueless, who saw this data on ocean acidification and misinterpreted it, and saying that it doesn't prove global warming, when in fact they misinterpreted it. So in responding, or the students' assignment was to respond to this prompt, but then to go back to the understanding of chemical equilibria, and to interpret this data and to respond to Ernie Clueless about it. So this was really an argumentative piece of writing. And so we had all of these essentially arguments that students had written in response to Ernie Clueless, that we wanted to better understand, really how they were doing the writing, and in looking at the arguments in particular. And we applied a framework that was put out by Grimberg and Hans, and they called it cognitive pathways. And this was really applied towards the science writing heuristic. So some of those of you who are familiar with that, this is where that came from. We adapted it for this particular kind of writing. So some of the codes, I guess, that they came up with, we didn't use because they weren't appropriate, and then we added a few. But this is the general idea, that there are a set of cognitive operations that occur in students' writing. And what do we mean by cognitive operations? These are really moves in the writing that have a specific objective or purpose for the writing. And we've oriented these in terms of their, what we're saying, cognitive complexity. So providing a definition in your writing, that's a pretty low complexity move in the writing. But in contrast to actually, say, comparing things, or to talking about the cause and effect of something, those build in complexity. So we applied those to a number of assignments, and I just want to explain a little further what we mean by that. So this is an example of a comparison. So in this case, students making a comparison between the carbon dioxide rise and the fall in the pH from the data that was shown. And so this would be coded, and this plot would be coded as a comparison. I keep hitting the wrong thing when I want to slide advance. And then here's an example of a claim. And notice that this claim involves both an observation and an explanation. So two cognitive operations go into the claim that they're making. And it involves observations about pH and carbon dioxide and equilibria, and relating those to an explanation about Le Chatelier's principle. So we applied these codes, or the cognitive operations, to this set of writing. And I guess I should add that, as we'll see in a minute, that the units for coding wasn't necessarily a single sentence. It could be multiple sentences, and it was really just for that single operation. Once we had coded these, and I'll say that this was a great deal of work by an undergraduate, and then Alina Moon, who many of you know, who's a postdoc in the group, to apply these. And once they had them all applied, then they sorted the assignments into high, medium, and low tiers. And that's just based on what they're calling the average weighted complexity. So thinking about this in terms of the scale of the complexity of those operations. And then looked particularly at the high and low tier assignments, just so that we would have the most contrast between what they were looking at. So this is a low complexity pattern. So this is an example of what a single student, the kinds of cognitive operations that we saw in a low complexity piece of writing. And some of what you might notice, first of all, is that they're using low tier, or low cognitive operations, like a lot of observations, some definitions, and a relatively few of what we would call higher cognitive operations like cause and effect. And that most of these are more like a single sentence or two sentences. If we compare this then to a high complexity piece of writing, what we see is that rather than a lot of low complexity operations, they're using fewer higher complexity operations. So here they've shown a deduction, and notice that a deduction takes many more sentences in that operation. And then, there might be a fewer low complexity items, but for the most part, they're using fewer and higher cognitive operations in their writing. And so that really sets them apart in terms of thinking about how we analyze that. And we could look at the frequencies of these, the number of instances that we saw across all assignments, all of the low tier assignments and the high tier assignments. And you can see again that for the low tier assignments, collectively, they're using a lot more of these low complexity operations, whereas with the high tier assignments, they're collectively using a lot more high complexity operations. Okay, so we wanted to do, once we had that down, we wanted to understand the patterns in a different way, because the frequency counts would only tell us so much. And so we looked at something called the Markov Chains. And this is a simplified version of a Markov chain that's depicting how you might use it to analyze weather patterns. So in each Markov chain, you'll have a set of observable states. So sunny weather, soggy weather, and rainy weather, those are each observable states of weather. And then you have transition probabilities between those states. And those are really, what is the probability that a sunny day would follow directly after a rainy day? And so what we've done, and what Alina did, was apply this to the writing, these cognitive operations in the writing. And so the first thing that you do is determine a transition probability matrix, and you set some threshold. So our threshold is 0.15, and so all of these blue numbers are the transition probabilities between each of these states or each of these cognitive operations. So what is the probability that a student would follow an observation with a definition? Once you have that matrix, then you have your Markov chain, and you can apply that to a Markov chain. So this is the Markov chain for a low complexity tier, or for the low complexity tier assignments, of which there were 78. And a couple of things. So first, the average number of cognitive operations that the students made for these assignments was 9.7. So a lot more operations. And what you'll notice is the larger the circle, the more often that observation or that operation is used. So observation was the most prevalent cognitive operation that was used in the low tier assignments, followed by definition and comparison. And then you'll notice that the lines between, the more lines that you have connecting that operation to another operation is indicative of the number of time, of how frequently someone's going to return to an observation from a definition, for example. And so the higher connectivity that you see between observation and these other ones in definition, and some of those just shows that students are really going back and forth quite a bit between these lower cognitive operations here. Notice that argumentation didn't even get a circle, because that's how little students were actually using this. And that's the same with most of the higher cognitive operations. So we can compare that now to a higher complexity Markov chain. There were fewer higher tier assignments, and on average they used fewer cognitive operations, and that's what we saw in those frequencies that I showed a bit ago. And in this case, what you can see is that students are more likely to land on these higher cognitive operations. So claims, deduction, and cause and effect. We actually see argumentation as a cognitive operation by these students, and that those are happening. And then the lower cognitive operations, those are smaller circles. We're seeing those less often. So these are the implications of that. So first of all, we saw we compared low tier and high tier assignments in terms of their the operations that we're using. In high tier assignments, they used fewer higher complexity operations, which they synthesized together. And then the low tier writing assignments, they used much more operations of lower complexity, which were not necessarily synthesized together. And so what we really care about for this, or what we're thinking about, in addition to that, this is a really powerful, we think a powerful way to start to look at student writing that we might be able to potentially automate. One of the reasons that it's attractive to us is because it is domain general. And what I mean is that we might be able to use this to say something to students about their writing, no matter the topic that they're writing about, no matter if it's in economics or biology. And that's important because of the amount of work that goes on to try to figure out for a particular biology assignment, what we can learn about students writing about that content. And so what we really need is something domain general, and that's one of the reasons that we're very excited about that. And so that's where we're headed with that. Oh, and so we're at the end. I just made it. I know I went a bit long. So I won't spend too much time on the acknowledgements. I do want to particularly acknowledge Alina Moon and Solaire Fingenstedt-Quinn, who were the postdocs that contributed to those two studies, and then in addition, some of the things that I talked about earlier in the talk. And the two undergraduates that worked with them, Audrey Halim and Robert Muller. They did a lot of the work of, this is a ton of work to analyze writing in this way, and it was very impressive how they did that. And we also have support from various entities on campus for some of the technology that we used. Of course, our faculty partners, some of the support from the Sweetland Center of Writing, and then our funding sources. And I guess we're ready to have final questions.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Ginger. Fascinating part there in the second part. I'll skip straight to the question because we're a little bit tight for time. So I have two that I can see so far. One is when you talk about the misconceptions and the changes in misconceptions as a result of the feedback, how do you know it is a genuine change in misconception or a student mental model of that, their understanding, compared to the student just making a correction because they were told to make a correction? How could we begin to find out which of those two is happening?
Yeah, and based on the analysis we did, we can't claim that. We can't claim that students have changed their mental models about these particular misconceptions. This suggests that is part of it, and that could play a role. But I think that has to come about from a different direction. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, that we're doing a lot of interviews. So we have an interview protocol that we've begun to use for students after each of these writing assignments to talk to them. And it's kind of a reflective interview protocol. So thinking across the process of the assignment, and in terms of how did you use the feedback that was given, and so some of it's coming out there. And then the last piece, as we build this last piece to our automated peer review system, where students are reflecting on the process and on their own writing, I think some things could come out of it there. But yeah, certainly this paper, we can't claim anything about how students are changing their mental models, but more that this just suggests that that could happen as a part of the writing process.
Great. And then Madeline asks, how hard is it to train coders, and how is your inter-rater reliability for those parts of arguments? I think this is a fair.
Yeah, but I think the longest period of time between, or the thing that took the longest particularly for the cognitive operations, was for Robert and Alina to have their operational definitions refined enough so that they were getting some reliability. That is a big challenge, because we're not talking about a single short answer that a student is giving or something like that. That in this writing, there's a lot of subjectivity in applying that. And so getting good inter-rater reliability takes some time and a lot of meetings and a lot of discussions, both with the postdocs, and we often have undergraduates who are working with us, one of the things is that the writing fellows themselves are a really great pool of research help that often they're very interested in contributing to this, and they come to us with a particular understanding about the assignments and can help to identify misconceptions or cognitive operations. But I would say that the cognitive operations were particularly challenging, I think, to do that. And some of what we have found is difficult is getting not just a good inter-rater agreement, but then also as we're starting to get measures of inter-rater reliability, those are even harder. And so we're looking at different ways. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot in the writing, education and writing literature on, what's acceptable for that. And so we're kind of figuring that out as we go.
Great. And then I think a final question is one more general one. Obviously, the work you're doing is with early undergraduates, and typically, certainly in European systems, we tend to focus on writing more at later level when students are writing thesis. I mean, the literature you were quoting at the start, those reviews, did they make any case for this idea of promoting writing at an early stage? Is there any evidence to talk about the need to do this earlier, I guess? I'll let you answer that briefly while I sorry.
Oh, okay. So our collaborator at the Center for Writing actually took that on, and that was one of the reasons that she wanted to push forward with this project, because she saw that there was quite a bit of writing happening at the upper level in the disciplines, but not as much as at the introductory level. And so they have conducted a longitudinal study, really that was more so looking at transfer than anything, but that kind of points to the value of doing this at the introductory level. I think that's the sort of holy grail or big white whale of our friends over in writing, that they want to show that writing needs to happen across the curriculum at both introductory and upper level. We haven't done that particularly yet. I think that's quite a challenge. And I would have to actually ask her where she published that longitudinal study, because it's not in any, science education journal. It's somewhere in the writing world.
Yeah, great. I mean, I guess for those of us arguing and advocating for having it at earlier years where there is a sense that it's more work intensive, that would be useful. So I might contact you about that. I'll finish because we're a little bit over time, but I think that's just a sense of how interesting and informative and just how much discussion there was about your seminar. So thank you very much, Ginger, for all of the effort in preparing and sharing your interest and expertise in writing to learn in chemistry. So thank you very much. There is virtual applause coming in as I speak, and I will let you enjoy that. While I have the audience, I'll just mention our final webinar in this series for the year will be Vicente Talanque. Of course, many of us will know his extensive work, so we're excited to hear his webinar, which will be 23rd of May. He's given me the very intriguing title, Controlling Intuition, so I look forward to finding out what that will be about, and we'll put details on our website. But please just join me now in thanking Ginger very much for her webinar, and I will stop recording, and this recording will be available on our website. So thank you, Ginger.
Thank you.